Okay, thank you. Well, welcome to the 21st meeting of 2013 of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public should switch off their mobile devices as they can affect the broadcasting system. So, agenda item 1 today is evidence session on the Common Agriculture Policy and neonicotinoids with Owen Paterson MP, Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. I very much welcome Owen Paterson to our meeting, and I'm sure he can introduce his official with him just now to us, and I don't know whether you wish to make a short opening statement, but we'd welcome whichever choice you have.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to the committee. I think it's a really good idea that we have these sessions, and I hope this will be first of many. Can I begin by introducing Martin Nesbitt, who does sterling stuff, working, I think, under the title of Sherpa, doing detailed negotiations on our international issues, particularly on CAP, where we are coming to, I hope, and I really do hope, we're going to get a conclusion shortly to these very lengthy negotiations, which are, of course, extremely complicated. I think if I could just begin by setting out where I see DEFRA's priorities, and I'll try not to take too much of your time. I came in September with a clear remit from the Prime Minister to grow the rural economy. And my two absolute overriding priorities are to grow the rural economy and to improve the environment. And I do not see those as mutually exclusive. So within that remit, there will be many areas of activity. Obviously, many of them are devolved here, but direct activity, which is a benefit to us, is rolling out broadband. I see getting broadband into the most remote corners of the United Kingdom as being probably the most dramatic step we could do to improve the rural economy since the stirrup or the canals or tar macadam or the railways. I just think it will be just a huge benefit, as will improving our mobile phone system. In England, we're very much involved in flood schemes, so there's direct activities where DEFRA is involved spending government money. I then think, working with devolved ministers, we have a huge role helping grow the farming and food sector, which is our biggest manufacturing industry across the UK and shouldn't be forgotten as such. And I think my priorities there are that 22% of the food eaten in the UK is imported, but could be produced here. So yesterday, for instance, I went to Highland Spring, which is a glorious example of a completely indigenous business, which is very actively pushing out imports. So I was told that one of the main French brands is no longer for sale in the UK, and that UK brands have actually overtaken foreign bottled water brands, and delighted to see that Highland Spring is the leading brand in that. So that's a really good example of how we can progress on import substitution, and I'll be holding a summit on this shortly. I then think we can help on exports. And of course, in Scotland, you've got the most magnificent leading product, Scotch whisky, which is a huge help for all UK products, leading the way on quality, reliability, and cachet. I think the cachet of Scotch whisky, when we went to Shanghai, was really evident. We took the largest delegation ever of exporters to Shanghai and the biggest food show. And it was really interesting going to the Diageo sales house in Shanghai, showing how Scotch whisky is right up there with other lesser products, cognac, for instance. And I think it's a real help for us having a really leading product, helping sell UK products abroad. So on that, though, of course, we found there was paperwork problems. We get this with regulation, health certification around the world. And I think there's a real role for DEFRA helping work with UKTI and other bodies, helping promote exports of products around the world. On the environment, much of this I'm conscious is devolved. But I'm absolutely clear that you cannot improve the environment if you don't grow the economy. Some of the most catastrophically damaged environments I've ever seen were at the back end of the Soviet Union, seeing brooks running black with oil in Albania after the ghastly Hoxha regime had just been removed. I was there very shortly after Hoxha went. So I'm absolutely emphatic. We will not improve the environment if we don't have a prosperous economy. And one idea that I'm looking at introducing in England is the idea that instead of having this sterile battle between an economic project and an environmental asset, there might be a bypass or a building project which might impinge on some water asset where there might be famous amphibians or there might be bats or some ancient woodland. The first step is to mitigate. If you can't mitigate, you say that the environmental asset has a value, and in order for the economic project to go ahead, it has to be replicated or, I would hope, improved elsewhere. So that's the idea of offsets is something I've looked at in Australia and I'm very taken with, and we'll be bringing forward a government paper shortly on that. And then, of course, we have a whole range of schemes, mainly under the aegis of Pillar 2 funds. And my broad view on CAP, which brings the two together, both the economy and the environment, is that down the road, and my views on this have been slightly exaggerated, but down the road, I would like to see decisions on food production decided by the market. It was very interesting going to New Zealand to see how, having taken away the distortion of a very heavily regulated and subsidized system, they have now got an absolutely booming agricultural sector. But for instance, their sheep population has come down dramatically from 70 million to 30 million, but they're actually exporting more sheep meat. So there are lessons there, not all entirely applicable, because I'm fully aware that there are parts of the UK where you cannot survive just on food production alone. But on top of the benefit provided by landowners and farmers, there's no market mechanism to compensate them. So all the good, mending stone walls, keeping predators down, keeping the bracken down, etc., rides a huge tourism industry, which is very, very important here. And I'm quite clear there is a very clear role for taxpayers' money to be spent compensating landowners and farmers for the public benefit they provide, the public good, for which there is no obvious market mechanism. And you have different schemes up here, but in England we have our Pillar 2 schemes, which I think do provide a very valuable service. So we're never going to be like New Zealand. There is always going to be a clear role for some public intervention where it's not possible to survive on food production alone, but where there is an enormous benefit in managing and improving the countryside. Move on quickly to my other two priorities. They would be to protect the UK from animal disease and to protect the UK from plant disease. Now on animal disease, we have obviously worked very closely with the devolved administration. We have a particularly horrendous problem with bovine TB, which thankfully is not affecting you too much at the moment, but that would be where my main efforts are concentrated at the moment. But we do have things like Schmallenberg, which is a horror that turned up last year, and we have to be constantly vigilant. And I think there is a real role for us working all together, and I think very importantly working with the Irish government. And I think we have very close relations with the Irish government. I was in Dublin with Simon Coveney recently. I think there's a real merit seeing how we can make sure that, for instance, our IT systems are compatible, and working with them on that sort of area. On plant disease, we had a very good example under horrendous conditions, this awful problem of cholera turning up, for which there is no known cure. It had blown in on the air in East Anglia, and partly up the East Coast, but also had come in on young stock because there'd been this bizarre trade of sending seedlings to Holland and bringing them back, which was, looking back, crazy when we knew that was or some people knew that was an area of disease, and this disease had been out there for some time. We did a unique operation. We surveyed the whole of the UK, broke it down into 10 kilometre squares, and worked very closely with your minister here, and there was absolute, full cooperation on that. And I would, I then appointed a task force to look at how we do protect the UK from plant and forest disease, protect our forests. There are real lessons in biosecurity from Australia and New Zealand. We're just not on the same starting point. And the task force has reported one of the first things we want to bring in is a risk register. And if you look at cholera, there must have been evidence. There must have been pieces in horticultural magazines out in Poland back in the late 1990s, which someone could have picked up if they'd been instructed to. So there's a lot of work to be done on that. But I think also I want to meld in the lessons we've learnt on biosecurity, where the attitudes are completely different. I saw small JCBs, second-hand JCBs, being completely stripped down at the container base at Sydney Port and fumigated. Just the whole attitude to imports is very, very different. And with the constraints of being within the European Union and the European rules, I think there's an awful lot more we can do. I think on all this, I would just like to stress, we work very closely with your Scottish Minister on the horse meat scandal, which was an issue of absolute fraud. He was tremendous, worked very closely. He and Al Davis came down to London. We had a summit with food businesses. And I think the point I'd like to leave you on working with the Devolves, we work very closely with the Devolves. We respect their position, and we agree with them on far more than we disagree. And I think that there is some exaggeration of the differences. The manner in which I work, coming finally to the CAP negotiations, is that officials work closely with Scottish officials and Welsh officials prior to a meeting. Just before the council, an hour before, when we're right up to speed, I go through the agenda and I go through my speaking notes. And on several occasions, Richard's asked me to change things, and we changed the text. And that's how closely we work. The position of negotiation is obviously down to the UK minister. But the Devolves are always invited. Richard nearly always comes. We consult through the day when necessary. And for instance, the week before last, the Irish had an informal council in which only the member state ministers were invited. I made a point late in the afternoon on the first day of having a telephone conference with the devolved ministers, and Richard was involved, bringing them up to date on what had happened that day so I could get their comments. And actually, we offered another one the next day, but we agreed on that occasion we'd only do it if something exciting came up, and nothing particularly exciting came up. You'll probably come to this, but I'll just get it in. I've been very, very conscious of the Scottish requirements. Richard makes it very clear what they are. And I think we have pretty well got an awful lot of what he wanted. The most important thing we have achieved is one of the first things we asked for in one of my last moments speaking in the council was to get regional decision-making. I'm fully aware of how important that is, and that was an absolute priority for us as UK negotiators. It was not very popular with some other member states. I think you should not underestimate that. But we've got it through, and I think we're in a position now is that you will be in a position, if we can get this reform through, and we're now into the trilogue stage with Parliament, which is very complicated, if we can get this through over the next few weeks, it will be a Scottish CAP. I think that's the real message. The decisions will be made at regional level. We've got that agreed. So that gives a very quick cant around where we are. I'm delighted to be here. I hope you notice I spell my name in the correct way, because my grandfather came from Hamilton. My father went to school up the road at Loretto. Used to do a lot of business here when I was in the leather trade, and it's great to be back. When I was doing the fishing paper, I had a huge amount of help from the Scottish fishing sector, and I look forward to coming back again on that. But I'd also stress this is not my first visit. I was here a few weeks ago, went to Nigel Miller's farm, and I'm back for the Royal Highland Show, I think, the week after next.
Welcome to the committee. I'm sure we'll deal with many of the questions that arise from your current statements. We've heard what your objectives were. So what's the rationale for supporting farmers through the CAP?
Well, the CAP exists. We would like to see the CAP move, as I've indicated, in the direction set in trade by McSharry and Fischler. I think the days of significant public support leading to the production of unwanted food products are gone, and my whole drive through this reform is to keep that reform moving in the right direction. There are significant, I would call it regressive elements, both in the Council and in the Parliament, who would like to see us go back to significant public support of food production, and I think that would be a big mistake. I think given the current difficult circumstances in which many of our taxpayers find themselves, there would not be public support for significant subsidy of unwanted food products. But, and there's this big but, which I did get in my introduction, there is an absolutely clear role for government help through taxpayer funds supporting landowners and farmers where it's not possible to make a living just on food production alone. So I think that is the very broad drift of where I've tried to push these negotiations. And I think we have had some significant success so far in stopping some of the regressive ideas being put back into the CAP.
You talk about regressive ideas. Do other EU agriculture ministers share the Secretary of State's views, your views?
I think it's fair to say we're very divided. We have built up a number of alliances with states on all sorts of issues. What is interesting, we have allies on one issue who may not be quite so helpful on another. But I think there is a group of us who are very much driven by my agenda and are very sympathetic, and we've worked pretty closely together. But no secret, there are some states where there are calls for more taxpayer intervention, which I think personally would be a mistake, and I think would be out of tune with the mood of the public and the taxpayer. And I'm very assiduous in mentioning the taxpayer and the food consumer in our debates. I'm afraid some states don't mention them very often.
And the taxpayer plus farmers and the environment, are all involved in this discussion about the CAP. What benefits are there then for the taxpayer from your approach?
Well, I think it's massively in the taxpayer's interest to have a thriving farming and food production sector. I think there's been quite a lot of complacency in recent years that there was unlimited, safe, cheap food available beyond our shores, which only had to be shipped here at the flick of an email. And I think we should not be complacent about that. The world population is moving from 7 billion to 9 billion. And as an example, going to New Zealand, which is a huge food exporter, New Zealand, I think we were told, could feed 30 million people. Well, you knock off 5 million New Zealanders, that's only a net addition to world food of 25 million people. A complete round of drinks when you look at the populations in India and China. And so I think we should not be at all complacent about food security, where our self-sufficiency has steadily come down in recent years. We have a real national interest in having a thriving food production sector. And, I get back to my earlier comments, we have a real national interest in having an environment that is not protected but is improving. We very clearly as a government want to leave the environment better than we found it. And that was the clear lesson from the Lawton report, which we endorsed. And of course, up here, you have that in spades. There's an enormous dependence here on incoming tourists. And tourists would not come here if the Scottish landscape did not look as wonderful as it does.
Indeed, but we have a project from this government of sustainable economic growth, which involves a variety of means to use our land area. So therefore the taxpayer presumably would benefit from sustainable economic growth, and so would the farmer, and so would the environment.
I entirely agree. We want to see a growing rural economy and we want to see an improving environment. I think the two run together.
Well, looking then at the negotiations on the CAP that have taken a very long time, as we all know, we also have in Scotland the specifics of the move from historic to area payments, and that kind of a significant change for farmers here. But England's already adopted an area payment, and other changes are modest rather than radical. Is there a direction of travel emerging about where the CAP is heading over the longer term? That is, can we see from what the Commission has proposed this time round where it's going to want to head post-2020?
Oof, that's looking into the crystal ball. I'm rather concentrating on this round. I think, first of all, on internal convergence. We in England have had an absolutely horrendous time. The system which was brought through by the last UK government was fiendishly complicated. And I think there are real lessons for you here on what not to do. So I would offer you very happily an open invitation to come down, talk to our officials, talk to the RPA, and see how not to do it. We have spent 590 million euros in what are politely called disallowances, which bluntly are fines for infringement of these over-complex rules. And I would very much hope that you would take advantage seriously of our experience and come and learn, because you are setting forth on the road from historic to area payment. I hope you appreciate the negotiations we have managed to get in a change in the first year. The Commission originally wanted 40% in the first year, which we thought was a bit rash and precipitate, and we've got that limited to 10%. I hope you've appreciated that. Will help you. But I would really appeal to you to come and look at how the UK the other parts of the UK, the 3 parts of the UK that haven't done it, I would hope they would all come to see how we've done it in England, because there are real lessons. I'm pleased to say now the RPA has absolutely got a grip on things. We've got an extraordinarily high proportion of our payments out in the first week in December, well over 97%. So we've now got a system which is working very well. And as a constituency MP, from North Shropshire, I got a huge agricultural interest. I'm trying to think when I had the last letter complaining about our RPA. So we have been through it, but it was a really horrendous process. When it started, it was absolutely ghastly as a local MP. So I really would ask you to take full advantage of our experience and to learn from it, and not to underestimate how difficult it is. I do think it's the right thing to have done, though. I mean, I really do. I think the anomaly that by 2020 we could be making payments on economic activity going back to the late 1990s is ludicrous and very hard to justify in the eyes of the public.
I just want to point out, or just to clarify for us, that you would expect the area payments to be more or less working fully by the middle of the term between 2015 and 2020, I expect, rather than at the back end of 2015
well,
and 2020.
Yeah, this is a pretty contentious area where, I've got to be honest, I'm slightly standing back, because this is a matter of intense interest for some other member states. I think my main service for our devolved regions is we've stopped the rush. I think the rush for 40% of the first year was rash. I think my position is, we've made it clear in negotiation, we would like to see this well advanced, but we don't want to see it done in such a hurry that everybody falls over. I think that's the most important thing. So it needs to be done in a steady and rational manner. But I think the further we could get, broadly, and I'm being deliberately inexact on that, the further down the road we could get by 2020, the better. Because I think it would be good to have a common base and area payment. But don't forget, some countries are opting out completely. Some countries are simply not going to pay whole swathes of their geographical territory.
We'll come to that in due course. Claudia Beamish had a supplementary on this point.
Morning, Secretary of State. Could I ask you briefly, just to take you back to your remarks about New Zealand and how it was, as I understand it, well, I don't know a great deal about it, but left to the market when there was a quite major shift in less sheep farmers in New Zealand, whether the New Zealand government put in place any transitional arrangements to support those farmers, because I can't quote the exact figures that you told us, but it seemed like a major amount. And I'm wondering if you're talking about a shift in production or radical changes for our farming communities here, how you would see that happening here.
Well, what I'm saying is that there will be, through this round, a Pillar 1, which will provide significant sums of public money. This is easily the biggest part of the whole EU budget, and will continue to be so. But the point I've been making in the talks is that we should not be frightened of allowing decisions to be decided by the market, and that I have great confidence in our own farmers and in our brands, and you've got some wonderful brands here in Scotland, which are world leaders. We shouldn't be frightened of that, because we have significant growth in many parts of the world. We have significant population growth forecasts, and there are enormous opportunities. And we got this huge chunk of 22% of our own food, which we're still importing, which we can perfectly easily produce here. So I'm absolutely not frightened of having the market decide. But there is not going to be some great leap into the free world of New Zealand here. That's quite obviously not going to happen, because I believe also very strongly that there is a role for state activity compensating farmers for the environmental benefit on which rides the whole tourism industry, which I think I touched on. So if you look at New Zealand, very crudely, after a quick visit, they had a very tightly regulated agricultural regime, with significant subsidies, and they had a very large population of what were called sheep. They weren't of any great value, and it's extraordinary, the figure. They went from 70 million down to 30 million, but they're actually exporting more sheep meat, because they got better quality sheep. They put the money into genetics, into breeding, and into marketing. And it was very, very interesting to New Zealanders. Everything was focused on quality. So they don't talk about milk volume, for instance. It's all about protein. It's all about protein and kilos. It was just the whole attitude was different. And that is where we should be going, because there are these enormous opportunities out there which we can address. Now, what happened, what was fascinating, of course, and perhaps they were lucky because of their landscape, on the land which was vacated by subsidized sheep production, they've created a world-class wine industry. So you literally went down a road on a Sunday morning, there was a dairy farm on the left, there was a sheep farm on the left because the land was good, and on the right, where the land was rougher, there had been a significant investment by a guy who actually used to work in the City of London, a $20 million investment in a brand new winery, exporting a product. So that's what happens when you let the market take over. People will find productive things to do with their land. Now, we're miles from that here. What I'm saying is we should not be frightened. And I have great faith in our farmers and our food producers and our manufacturing industry to grab the opportunities. What I don't want to see is their efforts hampered by over-regulation or over-direction by what may be very well-intentioned subsidy, but what's obviously very distorting subsidy.
Thank you. Jim Hume and then Graham Day.
Yes, thank you, Convener, and good morning, Secretary of State. Just regarding New Zealand, it's often been highlighted as free market and no government interference, but I too have visited New Zealand and of course I have an agricultural interest out with this Parliament, but I believe the New Zealand government actually wrote off farmers' debts when they changed the subsidies. They don't have the same animal welfare as standards as we have ourselves. I know the wine industry over there is, in some parts, finding some difficulties because of a lack of market. And there still are government grants and initiatives out there, irrigation fund, growth partnership initiatives, sustainable farming funds, etc. So it's maybe just a little bit simplistic just to say that it's absolutely no government interference, and of course, as you said, the government also spends quite a lot on actually marketing the products of New Zealand. So it's maybe just a different way of doing what we do here.
Look, I would entirely agree with every word. It is not simplistic. My idea is not simplistic to say, over the free market, go hang. There is significant government involvement in Australia and New Zealand in animal research, in animal disease research. We went to Geelong, Australia, looking at what they're doing on animal diseases. There is very, very significant government activity. The point I would make is all that government expenditure and effort, which is where I would like to see it directed in the UK, is better directed into research, into disease research, into what they're doing on biosecurity, into training, into agri-technology. We're going to bring forward an agri-tech paper. We're working with Vince Cable's department at the moment. We're going to announce that very shortly. And for instance, it's no secret that I'm an enthusiast that we should look judiciously at the potential benefits from using GM technology. So that is where I think these public funds should go. What I'm trying to get away from is the old 1960s, 1970s attitude. The way to have happy farming is just to pile money into unwanted product. And you end up with, we've all been through this, wine lakes and milk lakes and grain mountains. That's not the way ahead. I don't think that's a sensible use of money. You're absolutely right. This idea that the Australian government, New Zealand government walked away from farming is absolute nonsense. These are absolute strategic industries for them. But what I think they did, they spent their money, which is answer your question properly, is they spent the money cannily. There's a lot of money spent on research. There's a lot of money spent on marketing. There is huge support in that way. And I think that's a smarter way of spending public funds.
Okay, thanks.
Graham Day.
Thank you. Good morning, Secretary of State. You've held New Zealand up as an example of a country which you feel has benefited from getting rid of agricultural subsidies, and you did that in front of the Lord Select Committee on the European Union. At that Select Committee, you also described England's wine industry as, and I quote, splendid and wanting promotion. If you succeeded in getting rid of, or greatly reducing agricultural support in the UK, is this somewhere you would redirect the money saved to support England's wine industry?
Well, I think yes, I'm very happy to repeat myself. I just said that. Absolutely. I think there is a clear role for government promoting products. We were at Highland Spring yesterday, where that meeting came about from a meeting I had with some very interesting figures in the Scottish food and drink industry when I was up here last. saying that they really felt there was a role for the government to help promote products. So, following that visit, I think we've got Highland Spring into one of our embassies. Why was our embassy buying local water? They should be buying Highland Spring, which has now happened, I'm pleased to say. So there's no question at all. And you look at other countries. The French are incredibly active on this. The Italians are active. And touching on the previous question, don't underestimate how active the New Zealanders and the Australians are promoting their initiatives. There's very much a clear role. So I took the largest delegation to China, as I said. It was 40 companies. Some of them splendid little entrepreneurial. I mean, I do think it's impressive selling tea to China. I think that's a really cool thing to do. But some people were there first. Mr. Walker and his shortbread, we went into, completely unasked, we went into a Tesco's in Shanghai, and there was Walker's shortbread. Good for them. Proper entrepreneurial business got there first. So there is a definite role, I think, for national governments to help promote. And they're very clear, talking to these marketing teams, that if you have a reception at a British embassy, it's a pull. It brings people in, and you can have a session. You can get marketing people to meet some of the buyers. They can meet potential agents and wholesalers. There's no question this is a priority for us.
Into what it is you're talking about today, but have you also thought about the timescales you would work to? You know what I mean?
Well, as I said, I'm dead serious about this. We should not be complacent about the pressure on food production. We need to get our act together now. We need a productive, successful agricultural sector and food production sector. We cannot depend on cheap, easy food being out there. There's predictions, NFU, because of the miserable weather we've had, our grain production is going to be down this year. But if you look at Farmers Weekly latest reports, there's going to be a big harvest in the States, which is helpful. And some grain prices have come back a bit. But we must not be complacent about this. This must be an absolute clear goal that we need to produce more food here. And we've got this massive open opportunity with 22% of the food that is eaten here could be produced here. Why do we have a 1.2 billion dairy deficit? Why do we have an almost 100% dessert deficit? Now, there are entrepreneurial companies stepping into the gap, and which is tremendous. I always quote it, but in my patch, I've got Muller, who make yogurts, who've gone from 0 to 1.7 billion pots of yogurt in 20 years. Because people are eating healthy yogurts, they're producing quite a lot of cream. They've been dumping 95,000 tons of cream on the world commodity markets. And Herr Muller very sensibly has pulled the rug on that, says, not mess around, we're going to produce butter. So he's spending £17 million on a butter plant. That is direct import substitution. Actually, might export some of it, which would be good. So there are real opportunities there if we allow people to be entrepreneurial and get out of their hair and help promote what they're doing when we go abroad.
And a final supplementary in this point. Yeah. Angus McDonald.
Yes, thanks, Convener. Good morning, Secretary of State. I've listened to you this morning, and given your a statement that you intend to, well, that it's your long-term policy to drastically reduce direct support and rely on the market, would you agree that if Scotland remains in the UK and the UK leaves Europe, then Scotland's farmers will get no direct support, as it's your policy to end support? And clearly, under the Barnett formula, Scotland's budget would get no consequentials, as the UK would not be providing direct payments to farmers.
Well, there's a pretty good rule on this occasion, which is not to answer a hypothetical question. You're piling about 3 or 4 hypotheticals on each other. I think before we end this session, you mustn't sort of do a caricature of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there is not great public support out there. This is taxpayers' money. And taxpayers are under pressure on their food bills and on their family incomes. There is no great sympathy for subsidising a simple activity. I think there is public sympathy for improving the environment. I think we can look the British taxpayer in the eye and say that the schemes which you've got here and our Pillar 2 schemes deliver a real benefit to the public, and they can go and enjoy the countryside because it is improved. I think there is a clear gain for our nation to have an advanced agri-tech industry, to use the very latest techniques, to have highly trained farmers, and to move into the very latest technology, and to help promote that by clever marketing, all of which not all of which, but an awful lot of which requires government money. What I'm saying is that is a better way of spending public money. I think it is, when you look at the countries, we just touched on two of them, Australia and New Zealand, when they freed up, they actually have very significant activity, which helps farming. I just think they direct their funds better. So, honestly, you must not have this simplistic caricature that I'm just saying, walk away, end the subsidies and abandon farming. Not a bit of it. I'm saying there will always be government activity, there will be taxpayers' money spent. I just think we should target it on areas of intervention which will be of real long-term benefit and not just maintain the status quo. What worries me about the Pillar 1 money at the moment, it's just flat. It just enables people to carry on, and it probably just keeps land prices artificially high, which makes it very difficult for young entrants. I think there's a much better use of intelligent, targeted use of that money, looking to the future, into research, marketing, and everything I just touched on.
Let's move on to some of the process, just for a start. Do you think we're going to stick to the timetable and get the CAP reform agreed by the end of this month?
Well, my betting man, I looked at the Racing Post this morning. I'd go about 60-40, I'd say. I'd really take my hat off to Simon Coveney, the Irish minister, who we get on really very closely with. It's a huge help having someone who really understands the industry, and obviously coming from a country with a huge interest in a successful CAP reform. So he has really grabbed it since the Irish took over in January. We were all beaten about the head to come up with a compromise. I've had to swallow all sorts of things, which I think you probably picked up from my comments I'm not entirely happy with. But I generally think the uncertainty is the most important thing. I think the uncertainty is bad for the UK. I think this long, rambling negotiation has got to come to a conclusion. People got to know where they are. And I think broadly, sometimes through gritted teeth, what the compromise that the Council came up with, that's the Council of Agriculture Ministers, if brought through as final policy, would be an improvement on the current arrangements and would continue the trend set by McSharry and Fischler, which is my absolute benchmark of a successful reform. Do a bit near the bone in some places, but overall, I think that will be improvement. We've now got to this incredibly difficult arrangement, which has come in since Lisbon, to work with the European Parliament. And there are some clearly very differing views, definitely opposed to mine. So I thought it was a very good idea, actually, of Simon's to get everyone together with the representatives of the European Parliament in Dublin a couple of weeks ago. And I think the Parliament members were quite struck. I think the most important lesson was they were actually stunned, some of them, by the determination of big countries like us and Germany and France, and we've all taken compromises, but we all really want to get a deal. That was the real lesson I think they took back to the Parliament. We do not want to go into months more wrangling with the Parliament and to rehash all the arguments. We've really thrashed this thing out to death. And we are all going to convene in Luxembourg shortly. And I would say there's a real good chance we'll get this through. I think we really do need to get it through because we run into much bigger timetables. You've got Bavarian elections in September, German federal elections in October. You've got to wait for a new German government to be set up. And you're then slithering into the next Euro election and a new commission. So I think it's very much in our interests to get a deal, to end the uncertainty, and to push on. And I would say, as I said, I'd go 60-40 chance of getting it through. But if it gets through, this will very much be a tribute, I think, to the Irish presidency, who really got a grip on this. And, of course, Commissioner Cholos has a real interest in this. I mean, he's been plugging away at this now for months and months and months. And his position weakens if we don't get through in June, because we're looking, as I've said, to the German elections and a new commission.
Well, looking at things internally in the UK, Angus MacDonald.
Yes, thanks, Convener. Could you tell us, Secretary of State, how has the UK government been working with the Scottish government to develop common positions on CAP reform, and why do you feel that the Cabinet Secretary feels that he's not been involved to a similar extent in discussions as he has been with regard to the common fisheries policy reform?
Well, I would entirely agree with him. I mean, Richard and I see each other very regularly. He comes to every council. And as I explained earlier, we have a pretty clear process. Our officials talk in depth with Scottish officials beforehand. A text is drawn up. We have an agenda, so there's a speaking note agreed on pretty well every question. There are opportunities there for Scottish officials to put in his ideas and to things we might want to raise under any other business, like we raised neonicotinoids once on that basis. But then we have a sit down. But an hour before we go in, so deliberately, right at the last minute, so we're absolutely up to date. We have a proper sit down, we have a proper discussion. And on several occasions, I've had suggestions made, and I've amended my notes. And I think, in fairness, we have delivered an awful lot of what was wanted. The key thing for Scotland, surely, given the different circumstances here, was to get regional decision-making. Now, that was contentious. There are key member states who are very uncomfortable with this. And I think you should not underestimate that we have made this a major plank. It was one of the first things I asked for. And in the dying moments of the last council, this was one of the last things I absolutely insisted on. And I've joined up with Belgium. We've written a letter, for instance, with the Belgian minister, making sure that the text is absolutely clear on this, that all 4 pillars are covered by regional decision-making. So I think, in fairness, that pretty well answers nearly all the questions on the detail, because this will be a Scottish CAP from now on. You will be able to design it according to the requirements of Scottish interests.
Yes, but the last 2 CAPs have been implemented by the Scottish Parliament. There's clearly some disagreement there, because we know that you've refused access for Scottish ministers to bilaterals, trilaterals at EU negotiations. However, Scottish ministers are allowed into fisheries equivalents. So why is it that the Scottish ministers are able to participate in fisheries negotiations to a greater degree than in agricultural negotiations?
Well, I think fishing is a bit different, because I think the interests of all 4 parts are very similar, whereas I think when you're representing the UK, there are 4 parts of the UK on agriculture, all of which are a bit different. But I think I think also these issues are quite contentious, and you have a bilateral. I mean, there are the sheer physical circumstances of it. Without being brutal, if you're talking the French and Germans in their languages, you don't have very long. There isn't time to go into translation, and I think I get more done by talking to them direct and then reporting back as I do with Richard. So if he's there, we'll have a meeting back in the UTCREP office, and I'll tell him what's happened. But all the ministers are very busy, and there isn't time, for instance, to go into translations with some of these ministers. You have to crack on, have a real direct conversation with them, and then come back. But you must not underestimate the trouble I do go to keep him informed. So, we had the informal council, and I know he was not happy at being invited. That was not my decision. That was the Irish presidency's decision. Only member states representatives were asked. But I was absolutely punctilious in taking time out, and we had it all booked carefully in advance for a proper briefing session with the devolved ministers, so they had their opportunity to hear what had happened and to make known their views. So I really do go to great efforts to keep him involved. You really mustn't feel that he's excluded in any way, but the facts are there is only one person who takes the UK seat, and that's obviously got to be the UK minister.
I'm sure you would agree that fisheries negotiations can be highly contentious as well, yet he's allowed to attend these. But here we go. Thank you.
Jim, thank you, Convener. Just regarding the 4 parts of the UK that you mentioned, and you've also said that regional decision making will be there. There'll be flexibility for devolved administrations. Just in your negotiations with those 4, Northern Ireland, Wales, England, of course that's yourself, and Scotland, how far advanced are each of these devolved administrations? How near are they to actually coming up with a complete plan that under their powers will fit in?
That's a very good question. You better address it to them. I don't run agriculture in Wales, Northern Ireland, or Scotland, but they should be, they should be clear. At the moment, this is in the text. We've made it an absolute priority that member states are allowed to decide at what level decisions are made, and we will decide should this reform go through that we made at regional level, and there will be complete decision making here on matters agricultural to do with the CAP on all 4 pillars. So get cracking. get working it out. How are you going to devise a Scottish CAP? Because it'll be entirely in your hands. It won't be in mine.
Yeah, I'm fully aware of that, but I was just wondering, in your talks with the various cabinet secretaries and those responsible for agriculture within the UK, how advanced do you see?
Well, I've got to be honest. I have to be honest.
You're the overseer of it all, if you like.
Well, no, I'm not. No. Very important. I'm not sort of nanny over the whole thing. No, we are making it very clear that we've agreed all along that this was a UK priority. And I have taken it absolutely as read that we've got this into the text, it's looking good, and it is therefore clearly the responsibility of duly appointed ministers in each of the devolved governments to make sure that they are prepared. So I very much hope preparations are going ahead at senior level here. But it's absolutely not for me to ask. That's Richard Lockhead's responsibility.
Thanks.
A question on the EU budget. Richard Lyle.
Good morning, Secretary of State. On the EU budget, one of the keys to the CAP reform is getting the agreement of the European Parliament to deal on the EU budget the heads of state and government made in February 2013. What is the latest on this, and what would your betting be? Earlier on you said about the odds. What would the odds be on this?
Well, I think the horse has passed the post. I mean, this has been decided. I mean, there was a vote in the House of Commons when opposition parties, SNP and Labour, voted for a sharper decrease in the budget. The Prime Minister had an incredibly difficult balance to hang on to the rebate, which of course is a massive bonus to Scottish taxpayers and all UK taxpayers, and an agreement has been set. So I think the sums are known, the totals have all been published. So that is not an issue for the Agriculture Council. That has been decided by heads of government.
Okay, thanks.
Are we happy with that? I mean, I think the opposition in the UK Parliament were arguing that things like the visits to Strasbourg and excessive bureaucracy were things that they needed cut. But the question about what the size of the EU budget is, will work through into agriculture. Will it get its fair share of cuts, or will it be greater?
Well, that's an issue to be addressed to the leadership of the Scottish National Party and the Labour Party. I mean, they voted in the way they did to reduce the budget. So I can't comment on what their thinking was, and I'm afraid I didn't attend every minute of the debates to hear their arguments.
No,
but the fact is the heads of government have now settled the budget. I think that is done. So what the task of the Agriculture Ministers' Council, on which I sit, is to work out how the CAP will be arranged in order to spend those funds.
And those funds are on an average as cut at a level which each other budget head in the EU is, or is agriculture cut more?
Well, the figures have all been published. I mean, for instance, on Pillar 1, I've got the figures here. In euros, 2014, it's 3,548.6 millions. 2015, it's 3,555.9. 2016, it's 3,563.3. And then 2017, it's 3,570.5. So that shows a very modest increase in cash terms over those years. But I think, to be honest, this issue has been, to answer your question, this issue has been settled by the heads of government. This is not for me to decide. The funds have been settled at a pretty senior level, and I don't see that unravelling. So to answer your question, I really don't see this being unravelled now. That's been settled. Okay. If it is going to be unravelled, those questions should be addressed to members of the European Parliament.
Fine, thank you for that. Alec Ferguson, further on this?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Secretary of State. I hope you'll forgive me if I say that if you come to the Highland Show the week after next, as you intimated, you'll miss it, because it's next week. But we look forward to seeing you there.
I'll be here next week.
It's good to know you're coming. Yes, I think you've just intimated that the Pillar 1 payments are likely to show a very, very modest increase over the next period of reform. Can you tell us what the situation is with regard to Pillar 2 payments in respect to the size of the budget, and how it would compare to
Pillar 2? Yeah, as the
previous reform period.
Serendipitously, I have the figures here, so I thought I might get asked. On Pillar 2, the figures for the next 4 years are 2014, 350 millions, 2015, 342.3 millions, 2016, 334.7, and 2017, 327.3. So there is a modest decrease there in the Pillar 2 figures.
And thank you for that. Are you able to clarify what criteria have been used to allocate these Pillar 2 funds between member states? Because there's obviously a difference if land area is used as a criteria as opposed to historic rural development spending. Can you enlighten us as to which?
But I think that's down for member states to decide how best to spend that. I mean, one of the proposals I really am opposed to is for modulation back from Pillar 2 to Pillar 1, which I really don't approve of. But as I've said, we're not going to win on absolutely everything that we want. And I am an enthusiast, certainly in England, for the benefits that our Pillar 2 schemes bring, because I think we can look the British taxpayer in the eye and say we are bringing you environmental benefits, which will not normally be provided through a market mechanism. And I think they have real value. And I do think there is good money spent there in training and development. And that, as I've said, is the general drift to where we should be going. I mean, I think the value of Pillar 2 is one of the problems I think we've got in the Council. There is still too much residual thinking of just maintaining the farming sector and supporting it with public money. There's not enough looking ahead, advancing it in development, technology and training. So I think the value of Pillar 2 is underestimated by some member states, and I think we are further down the road on using our Pillar 2 intelligently than some other member states.
Nonetheless, you do appear to have agreed a settlement which would suggest there is a modest rise in Pillar 1 spending. I have to emphasise Pillar 1 spending is incredibly important in Scotland, where we are 85% designated as less favoured areas, and that it puts a bit of a different accent on the need for direct support. And therefore, I'm very grateful that you've managed to come back with a deal that would appear to offer a modest increase in Pillar 1 spending up to 2020 at least.
Well, the person
despite your
I'm very grateful for your thanks. That's the person you should thank is the Prime Minister, actually, who negotiated this deal.
He's not here.
He's not, I'll pass on your thanks to him.
Please do. Thank you.
In that case, Jim Hume on Pillar 1.
Thank you, and thanks again. Just looking at the average Pillar 1 payments in Europe, they're about 260 euros per hectare. The UK is not far off that average at 250, but of course we're down at 107 per hectare euros in Scotland, and there are good reasons for that, because as my colleague Alex Ferguson just said, we're 85% LFA, 15% non-LFA. England is the very opposite of that, about 15% LFE. Therefore, there was less productivity and therefore less payments per hectare well into the past. But of course, we're now looking at convergence, and the member states, the Council had agreed that member states would reach by 2020 75% of the EU average. That's £196 per hectare if I've worked it out correctly. So overall, it looks like that what would come to the UK would be the same, but how would you see that being paid out within the devolved administrations? Would you be looking to converge payments within Scotland so that we would get up to at least 75% of the EU average?
Well, I think this is a real conundrum for the Scottish Minister once reform is through. You have this anomaly that it's not an anomaly, it's a very obvious fact that given the numbers Alex said, 85% less favoured, you've got this significant expenditure on very large areas of less productive land, but you end up with payments to individual farmers, which are, I think, the second highest in the whole of the EU. You do have this conundrum of the variation in Scottish farming. So, coming back down from Auchterarder yesterday, you saw some of the most productive and well-kept arable land you'll see anywhere in Europe. And I think it really is a question of balance to be decided by the Scottish Minister once this power has been given. And I think that's the whole point about what we're trying to get with this regionalisation. It does give you absolute power to tailor intelligent use of cap money to your own requirements. I mean, Alice's point, there's 85% LFA. You obviously, the pillar one is an important feature of farming economy here. And my view is that this really is for you to sort out. This will be, this will be my theme throughout this interview. This is going to be a Scottish CAP. It's for you to work it out according to your circumstances. Some countries, and I did touch on this briefly, I mean, Spain is going to exempt 19 million hectares. That's a pretty dramatic decision. So as they go from historic to area, there are whole areas of Spain which are just not going to be part of the scheme at all. Now, which is a fairly drastic solution, but that is a solution tailored to Spanish circumstances.
Just looking at what the responsibilities were in that question that I gave, it would look like that what would come to UK as the member state would be pretty similar to what we'd have before, because we're quite, at the UK level we're very near the average EU level. Therefore, when it's divided up within the UK, would you foresee giving to Scotland and England and Northern Ireland, of course, similar amounts to what has been in the past, and then for them to divide up? Or would you look at it, the UK as a whole, and think that it should be divided up per hectare, which would obviously benefit Scotland to what it was in the past?
I'm I think, approached with a diplomatic way of saying it from all sides on this issue. I mean, I was at the Royal Cornwall Show last week. There are very strong views from English farming representatives. But I also got repeated at the Farmers Club, surprisingly. I think the simplest way is to carry on the current basis and allow the actual divisions within the scheme to be decided at local level. There are discrepancies right across the whole system at the moment. There are big discrepancies in payments, in area payments, right across all the member states. But within the UK, if you look at the per farmer payment, it's £25,751 sterling in 2011 in Scotland, but it's as low as 7,255 in Northern Ireland. So there are already big differences depending how you carve this up. You could look at the area payment and it would be very different. So the area payment would be £130, 130 euros per hectare, and it would be 339 in Northern Ireland. So whichever way you look at this, someone can claim that they are being disadvantaged. There's always a case for grievance, I'm afraid. I think the fairest way is to say that the current broad envelopes continue up or down according to the budget as set by the heads of government. And then we have given this enormous privilege, I think, compared to other member states, to decide matters locally according to very different regional circumstances.
Thanks.
Okay, Alec Ferguson.
Thank you very much indeed. Secretary of State, you're absolutely right. If one looks at different figures in different ways, you can come up with all sorts of different things. One of the interesting figures is if you look at annual output, which puts Scottish farms at the second lowest in the UK, despite well, that's on output, which really sort of highlights the fact that we have a very different geography to work in. But the point I wanted to raise is that my understanding is that because Scotland's share of the payment sort of drags the UK's level down, there is going to be something that I will refer to as a convergent dividend from the EU that should come to something between 50 and 60 million pounds, is my understanding, simply given to the UK, simply brought to the UK because of the Scottish figures make it possible. Now, would you accept that there is therefore quite a strong case, as is made by the NFU of Scotland, for that money to be transferred directly, because it is brought about by Scotland's position, for that money to be transferred into the Scottish share out of the overall budget?
Well, I need to look at this because Nigel Miller I don't remember him raising that number with me when I saw him a few weeks ago. So I think what I'll do, I need to look at this in detail. But I think all the... I'll look at this. I think my sort of broad comment would be all these ingredients lead to our current position getting the UK global payment which I've outlined. And it would be very easy to pick out a special English characteristic or a special Welsh characteristic which might lead to an extra payment here or there. And I think that given all the ways that one can pick a grievance by choosing a particular figure and interpreting in such a certain way, that the simplest way is to carry on the broad basis we have at the moment under the national envelope, but to really stress that the division of that envelope will now be down to devolved governments, where there is very clear decision-making power to decide the division according to local circumstances.
But with respect, the division of the overall EU package will be made at UK level, and thereafter it will be up to individual devolved administrations to, as you rightly put it, make their own CAP. But I'm delighted you've said you'll take this away and look at it, and I'm sure we would all be grateful if you would write back to us.
Yeah, sure, no, I will have a look at it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Did you wish a supplementary at this stage, Angus MacDonald?
Yes, thanks, Convener. I have another grievance, Secretary of State, which I'm sure won't surprise you. While we're discussing discrepancies throughout the UK, could I perhaps turn to meat levies? Approximately 6.4 million since 2008 has been kept by DEFRA, or the promotional body for meat promotion in England, from levy income paid on livestock reared in Scotland but slaughtered south of the border, and I believe this figure is now 1.4 million per annum. Surely, Secretary of State, you can accept that the current system for collecting meat levies is unfair, and do you think it's right that levy paid on an animal born and reared in Scotland is used to promote produce south of the border?
Well, we discussed this, because we had a meeting with devolved ministers a couple of weeks ago, and David Heath is looking into this in some detail. I don't think it's quite as black and white as you've described it. It's obvious that with the reduction in abattoirs north of the border, significant amounts of stock are now being slaughtered south of the border. But what we're going to look at is to see, A, how the levy is spent, because I think there is significant promotion of beef or mutton, whatever it is, that benefits producers north of the border. I also think significant volumes of perhaps not absolutely top class, not premium brand meat is sold south of the border, and the sale of which is helped by UK schemes. So I don't think it's quite so simple to say this bullock was raised in Perthshire and it's ended up being slaughtered south of the border. The levy should automatically go back, because there is absolutely no gain to the Perthshire farmer from the levy being spent. I think there may well be gains in the export promotion we do on the premium stuff, but also helping sell the middle-ranking material, most of which I suspect, and we need to look at this properly, stays south of the border, where there may be an advantage for it being sold as a British product rather than a Scottish product. So I think we had a proper discussion about this, and we would like to resolve it. It is obviously contentious, and I know Rich Lockyer is very concerned about this. So David Heath is actually looking at the detail. But I honestly don't think it's quite as black and white as you've made out.
Well, I'm glad there are discussions ongoing, but there are, of course, untapped markets for the quality Scotch meat brand that the Scottish market would like to tap into on its own, and obviously the 6.4 million that's been lost so far would have helped us to do exactly that.
Yeah, but I've got to go too parochial, but when my brother was farming here, he used to sell his bullocks, which were absolutely superb, a brilliant eye for an animal. They used to go to Chelford and were sold to an absolute premium Scottish company in Inverurie, who then sold on to all the top restaurants right across Europe. So, this is the advantage of the UK. There are advantages in trade both ways across the border.
Well, sorry, Tim Hume.
Yeah, just to explore that point further, in the UK we're not quite 100% self-sufficient in beef, but of course Scotland is more than self-sufficient, so we have to export most of ours, if you can call it, down to down to England, where a lot of it, would you agree, is sold under the British beef label, because it is of course British, and also being someone who's from farming stock myself, living on the south of Scotland, which you wouldn't know, but there's a lot of trade in buying cattle from and sheep from south of the border, bringing them north, and therefore levies would be mixed up and intertwined. Would that be some fair points?
Yes, I agree. I think we've got to be quite careful not to see everything be mutually exclusive. I think there are gains both ways. But you're quite right. I mean, just citing my brother, don't underestimate the trade of premium product from south to north, going out as Scottish product. But I think what we need to do is to, it isn't absolute black and white and simplicity to say just because it was raised in Scotland and it gets slaughtered in England, the money automatically goes back. There is no advantage to the Scottish farmer. I think there are significant advantages because it isn't all premium product, and an awful lot of it does have to be sold to the multiple south of the border, where there might be, and we need to look at this, there might be advantage of being sold as British.
That's a moot question, which we'll come back to, no doubt. Moving on to Pillar 2 on CAP. The PAC inquiry, which you'll be aware of, made a final report showing how Pillar 2 allocations per hectare vary widely across the EU in the 2007-13 programme. Scotland has the lowest allocation of EU funds per hectare than any other member state. This shortfall is made up from modulation and with a large allocation to the programme from national funds in Scotland. National funds are clearly now much more constrained, and the Scottish Government has to reduce national funds that it puts into than it put into the 2007-13 programme. How is the UK's Pillar 2 allocations between the four countries at the present time being weighed up?
Well, I think I made it clear. I do value our Pillar 2 programmes. I think they do deliver advantage to all our taxpayers and are well worth defending. And so throughout negotiations, I made it very clear we would like to continue to be able to modulate 15% from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2.
And, quite a number of member states secured a special uplift for Pillar 2 funding, and you didn't, press for that, despite Scotland having the lowest allocation. Do you accept that it is too low for Scotland?
Well, don't forget we were under pressure from opposition parties to reduce the EU budget further than we actually went. So I think if you look at what the Prime Minister achieved, those figures on Pillar 2 do show a modest reduction over the years and show Pillar 1 holding up with a modest increase. But I think the numbers have been decided, unless the Parliament manage to unravel it, which I don't think they will. The overall budget has now been decided by the heads of government. It's for us to decide how to divvy them up. But what I'm quite clear is the Pillar 2 schemes are of real value. This is very unpopular with the NFU in England, but I think we should continue 15% modulation into Pillar 2 from Pillar 1.
Well, we must press you on some of these points. I don't know if you've ever visited a Highland farm or a croft in your tenure as Secretary of State.
I visited farms. My wife's family had property in Perthshire, so I used to go see farms in Perthshire on a regular basis. But as my current position, I've not made a formal visit to a Highland farm.
Or indeed to crofts, and it's in these areas that Pillar 2 is vitally important, because the taxpayer does want farming to provide the countryside, the environment and the environmental benefits, and that's the area which indeed an uplift in Pillar 2 funds would be a huge help for. What criteria are you using at the present time therefore to recognise all the scientific advice that shows that investment in these least favoured areas are going to have the biggest uplift for the environment that you say is something that you cherish?
Well, I think I've said it several times in this session. I'm absolutely clear of the advantages that Pillar 2 schemes bring to the environment, which are to the benefit of all taxpayers. But we came into power with the UK borrowing £300,000 a minute, and the Prime Minister, I think, has been absolutely in tune with the public mood that there was not an appetite for a huge increase in the EU budget. So the figures have been settled. How they are carved up is now down to the Scottish Minister. I mean, subject to the reform going through with the current text, and it's still an if, because I said it's 60-40 chance, but at the moment we're heading for a position where the Scottish Minister will have the power to decide the types of Pillar 2 schemes, the geographical areas that they're distributed in, and the carve-up of the total pot.
So, how is Scotland's share of the 2014-20 Pillar 2 budget going to be determined by you?
No, no. The budget has been. We've got the budget. That was the question here asked by Mr. Love. Yeah. The heads of state have settled that. Now,
but internally,
there are arguments within the European Parliament, but I don't see that being unravelled. At the moment, that we are obviously at official level, we are discussing this, but the broad envelope is decided. What I think that needs to happen here is there needs to be a proper debate within Scotland as to how these funds are carved up and how you best target them. I'm fully aware of these parts of the UK, and particularly parts of Scotland as we're here, where you cannot, go back to my phrase, you cannot survive on food production alone. And there is a very real benefit in spending taxpayers' money in those areas. The trick in this is to make sure that your schemes are targeted accurately and benefit those people in the most effective manner.
So basically, if Scotland has the lowest Pillar 2 funds in Europe, the UK has a part to play in rebalancing that from the budget which you have to spend as the member state on Pillar 2. So what are the criteria that you're using if you say that you see the value of Pillar 2, and yet we've got the lowest, and yet we've got the best environment
I think we're beginning
potential?
to repeat the debate we had a little bit earlier about
we want an answer on this.
area against individual. Well, you can pick the area payment, and then other parts of the UK will pick the individual payment. And Scottish individual recipients are the second highest recipients in the EU. So we can play around with this. The trick is to stop the blame game, to stop blaming Westminster for grievances and injustices, and to look at the fact that if our reform goes through, you will have huge power here to target public funds accurately at those parts of Scotland that you think deserve best.
Okay.
Honestly, that's a very clear message. We can go on and on and on about this, how we got here. You can quote the area payment. Other parts of the UK will quote, and they do vigorously to me. Don't underestimate that. People come to me the whole time and say, what are you doing paying all this money to Scotland when they're getting over £25,000 per head? Frankly, that's a sterile debate. We've all inherited what is a very complex system. There wouldn't be one of us round this table that would start the CAP from where it is now. There are all sorts of anomalies between the member states, as we very clearly outlined the last hour. There are very clear anomalies within the UK. The trick, I think, is to look ahead. I hope we'll get an agreement week after next, and that you will be able to design a CAP which is targeted on these, particularly on these Pillar 2 funds, targeted at the most vulnerable and the most deserving cases in Scotland. And that's really where the effort should be concentrated.
Thank you for that. Angus MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, just one way perhaps to simplify the argument. Would you accept that Scotland should receive 100% of any uplift in Pillar 2 in UK allocations, given that the UK has only qualified for the uplift thanks to Scotland?
Well, I have to look at that through the prism of how that will be taken in the other three areas. So there's England, and don't forget Wales and Northern Ireland.
Is that we've only qualified for the uplift because of the position in Scotland. So 100% of that money should come to Scotland.
Yeah, but there will be other aspects within the UK which will have led to other consequences within the total budget. So we can always pick out one particular area of activity, which might be Scottish or might be English, which might have led to something happening. I think the trick is to get beyond this. I'll try to explain that, to say that the broad outlines of the budgets are decided. The really key thing for you to get your heads around is how you target those funds at the most deserving causes within the Scottish agricultural sector. And you are the people who are best qualified to do that.
I think we understand that perfectly well. Nigel Dawn.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning. And my apologies for going elsewhere, as I had explained, and I have been to another committee and come back with a fairly successful outcome, I'm delighted to say. I'm wondering if I could just stay with this modulation issue, because I'm slightly confused, and forgive me if it was covered earlier. Is the total of the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, which will come to Scotland, something which is decided in Westminster? And we decide the Pillar 1 section, how much is Pillar 1 and how much is Pillar 2? Or are
well, no, the total UK allocation has been decided by the heads of state.
Yep.
And there is an arrangement now which carves that up, which I'm suggesting can be interpreted as unfair by virtually every part of the United Kingdom, by someone. I'm suggesting we carry on that formula. What I'm stressing is that you now should be concentrating your efforts on how you carve that up to the best advantage of Scotland.
So you will be giving us a number which is the Pillar 1 for Scotland and another number which is the Pillar 2 for Scotland. And you decide.
I'm here today and I'm hearing very loud and clear that you're very unhappy about the per hectare payment. I was at the Royal Cornwall Show hearing very loud and clear from English farmers about the shocking anomaly of how much more Scottish individual farmers get. So wherever I go, someone can find agreements. What I'm saying is the heads of state have agreed the broad envelope, Pillar 1, Pillar 2. We have a formula, and our officials are looking at the details of this at the moment, so it's not absolutely set in stone, but we're looking broadly. We stick to the current arrangements, but you are best deployed using your time, working out how you design a Scottish Pillar 2, which helps your most disadvantaged agricultural areas.
Thank you. That's clarified it in my mind, and I apologise if we're going back over stuff before. Can I then ask you, Secretary of State, you've mentioned that you agree with the idea of 15% modulation from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. There's no risk anybody up here would want to go the other way, I suspect.
There's appalling. There are some member states who this may come out, which I think is very, very regressive, is to go from Pillar 2 to Pillar 1. That goes against everything I've been talking about.
Right. Well, I don't think there's anybody up here who would want to do that.
I'm delighted to hear that.
I'm really not seeing that. But there is a debate, I think, about whether that should be subject to match funding. I think George Lyon MEP explained the Council's position was to allow member states to have a 15% modulation 1 to 2 without match funding, whereas the Parliament's position, as he understood it then, was that there should be match funding from government. Well, where's your position on that?
I totally agree with George Lyon. We want to go for 50% without match funding. Don't forget, the Parliament does not raise money. The Parliament is very good at hollering left, right and centre for expenditure on all sorts of good causes. It doesn't actually have to raise the money. It doesn't have to look the taxpayer in the eye. It has to pay the money. So I'm quite clear, and I go right back to my earlier comments, we've got to bear the taxpayer in mind. You know, our taxpayers are having a tough time. They are facing difficult family budgets. We've got to bear them in mind. And I found myself, I think I'm about the only minister that raises their concerns consistently at Council. There are all sorts of producer interests within the Parliament clamouring for money left, right and centre, and they do a very good job representing their interests. I'm a UK minister. I have to sit in Cabinet bearing in mind the needs of our taxpayers, because they pay for all this.
I'm grateful for the clarification of that. Thank you.
Okay, changes to Pillar 1. Jim Hugh?
Yes, thank you again, Convener. Just regarding changes to Pillar 1, I was just wondering what your thoughts on the outcome will be of the shift from historic to area payments, and how fast do you think Scotland would have to move to area payments from the historic situation we are at the moment?
Well, that is still being thrashed out. I mean, I think what we have done, I have mentioned this earlier comments, I think we've done a service in stopping the, I think, rather too headlong rush to get 40% done in the first year. So we're going to 10%. There's a very complicated formula being worked out about where we should get to. My broad view is that everyone should pay close attention to what happened in England and to do this in a steady and methodical manner. But obviously, I do think it's going to be anomalous if there are significant parts of the CAP being paid on a historical basis in 2020, and the historical basis will be economic activity back before the year 2000. That's just going to look very odd and hard to defend in the eyes of the taxpayer. So my broad drift in the negotiations is that I'm very keen we don't rush this too much, but I think there should be a clear determination, and I think the Commissioner Cholos is very sensible about this. We should be moving as far as we can towards an area basis towards 2020.
Obviously, the Irish have talked about quite a long transition, and
yeah.
I think the Minister here has talked about quite a short transition. But obviously, with your experience, and you've said you think it should it all be transitioned by 2020. You said you find it difficult to argue if it was still the same at 2020. But what would you see as
well, I just think politically it is hard to look our taxpayers in the eye and say we're paying out significant sums of public money on the basis of what will be over 20-year-old economic activity. And, why should those people receiving those funds? And you've got the issue here, of course, of slipper farmers and wanting to bring new entrants in, which is a real anomaly, which we very much recognise. It's very unfair that people want to come in who get absolutely nothing. So I think from your point of view, I think the further you can go, the better. But I really do say, please come and learn from our example and learn how not to do it. Mm-hmm. There is a very clear lesson from us that if you make it too complex, you do it too fast, there will be vicious fines, which are politely called disallowances.
You would like to put a rough timeline, 5 years, 10 years,
well, no,
2 years?
But no, I'd like
this stage.
No, I'm not going to go. No, because we're still negotiating this with other member states.
Yeah.
I'd like everybody to go as near as possible by 2020 without falling over, if that helps.
Yes, yes, I could read into that if you like. I'll come to the slipper farmers in a moment, but just regarding the greening requirements, I just wondered what the state of play between the Parliament and the Council is in your view on greening of CAP.
Well, I think the big service I hope we've done, we made it very, very clear from the beginning that you had to get ericaceous in the text. That was a very important part of that. We raised that very early on. And I made it clear to Commissioner Cholos that we will respect his 3 criteria, but for England, what we want to do, we want to design our own system to deliver his outcomes as simply as possible. We are absolutely stung. I couldn't believe it when I came into DEFRA and found that we were sending these huge sums back. Now, 590 million euros is completely unacceptable. So in every stage of the negotiation, I've said, please let us devise our own system and keep it as simple as possible. Fully respect, and we accept your proposal, because Commissioner Cholos is absolutely determined about this, and he's been completely forthright about this from the beginning. But please let us devise our own system to deliver your outcomes, using our own inspectors, our own mapping, and our own IT systems, so we can make it as simple as possible. And there is very real alarm, which I think, we managed to assuage amongst certainly English farmers that we were going to impose a very complex system which was going to gild the lily and gold plate and all these other phrases. I want to deliver the 3 outcomes in as simple a manner as possible, and I think that's probably what you will want to do up here.
Thanks. And just back to your point that you briefly brought up there regarding what may be called the slipper farmers. How do you see the requirements will ensure a minimum level of activity, and how will this allow support to be restricted to active farmers?
I think that's an absolute classic where we are really chiselling on the things like new farmer and stuff like this. This really should be voluntary, and it should be decided locally. I mean, you are the guys that really know who you want to bring into the industry, and how they qualify and who to exclude. I'm really battling against having this mandatory across Europe, because I think it'll be a bit of a blunderbuss. I really think this is just the sort of detail where I'm pushing the whole time to keep it voluntary.
Yeah, sorry, just regarding a minimum level of activity, are you saying that it should be up to...
Well, if it's voluntary, it's down to you.
Yeah.
So you decide.
Yes.
You're fully aware of the problem slipper farmers here, and you've probably all got some very simple, sensible ideas on how you could use public funds to compensate them, how to bring new entrants in who might be... this totally arbitrary idea of the age, I think, is a nonsense. You've got older people coming into the industry who don't qualify for the age, but it's very unfair on them. They don't get any money at the moment. So I think this is an absolute classic case where our regionalisation is keep it regional, keep it voluntary.
So just to cut through the regional part, then how would you see in England that happening? How would you see yourself in England stopping so-called slipper farmers? It's maybe not such an issue, maybe it is, I'm not sure.
No, it's not really such a big issue with us. I mean, I've got to be honest, I'm doubtful of the value in England of what might be quite a modest payment actually bringing people into the industry. Are they really going to make a sort of big lifetime decision around a modest payment just because they count as a new entrant? I'd prefer to spend the money on making sure that our new entrants are properly clued up, can read accounts, have done a bit of study on how to run a business.
Thanks.
We found it difficult to find anybody under 40 to ask the question about that at the moment. Claudia Beamish.
Could I ask, with approximately 40% of Scotland's farmland is estimated to be under high nature value farming systems, and as this provides a high level of public and environmental benefit, has DEFRA been doing anything on Scotland's behalf to ensure that adequate support is available for land managers through national envelopes, allowing a percentage of Pillar 1 to be used to support this type of farming for the environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that I think is really all devolved. I mean, how you divide these funds up really is down to you. I mean, I don't think I have been involved in that because I think someone asked it earlier. I've just taken it as read. It has always been a goal for us in these negotiations to get all 4 pillars decision making decided at regional level. So it's not for me to get involved in the mechanics of how that's done.
Okay. Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener. Secretary of State, you've talked today about regional decision making and a Scottish cap. Can I seek clarity on whether that extends to coupled payments? I know you articulated your own position previously on this, but do you recognise and appreciate the need to support beef production in Scotland in order to maintain the critical mass, and because it is of course integral to our food and drink sector? And will you and DEFRA respect the views of the Scottish Government and the industry indeed that we need to have the beef calf scheme continue? I ask specifically because there, as I understand it, sections of the media have speculated that DEFRA as the member state, have a de facto veto and could simply not pass on notification of the scheme to Brussels.
No, I think coupled payments is rather a good example of how I've handled differences of view, and I'm fully aware of the value put on the calf programme here. And actually, I'd like to come and see it. I think that would be helpful if I actually went to see a farm and see actually how it works, because I have asked a number of figures here how it works, and no one's given me a clear answer, so I think I'd better go and see a recipient and hear it on the ground next time I'm up. My view is very clear. Right at the beginning, I said I think we're better spending public money, targeting it on technology and development and training and everything else, and the Pillar 2 stuff. And my sort of gut feeling is that subsidising production will probably lead to unwanted product, which has to be dumped somewhere else. We've clearly got a different opinion on that, and circumstances in Scotland are different. People have explained to me the merits of the calf scheme. So we held out for a long time on 0 couple payments. We did not want to see couple payments. But, I did listen to Richard Lockhead, and I did listen to a couple of other member states. And as part of the sort of final throws on the last couple of days, as a gesture to show that we had listened, and against my own personal gut feelings, I said, OK, well, we would accept 5% across the board, but it's got to be a level playing field. And now, I don't think that's as far as Richard wanted me to go. And it was certainly not as far as some members of the Parliament wanted to go. And there are elements of the Parliament still hollering for 15% plus 3. That's 18%. Now, that is a significant subsidy in any terms. Where we are is that we've ended up with 7 and 12 as being the council's compromise. And this is a classic thing when I talk about gritted teeth. I was not at all happy with that, you can imagine. But we had to accept that. I had to accept some things I didn't like in order to get the compromise through. I think Richard Lockhead's equally unhappy because it's not level playing field and it doesn't go as far as he would want. But I think it is an example that I did listen. We did move our position in order to be constructive in negotiations. And I'm not absolutely sure where this will end up. I think Simon Coveney is pretty robust. I think he does see. I mean, in Ireland there are there's a couple scheme. But I think, speaking for him as the president of the whole of the council, I would think probably he's going to dig in on 7 and 12. I think going to 15 and 3 in some cases is really going too far. But this, to answer your other bit of your question, this will be a decision for the Scottish Minister. If he wants to go for a couple of payments and he wants to keep the CAST scheme going, he has decision making on all 4 pillars. It's down to him. And it comes out of his Pillar 1 budget. So it's over to him.
So to summarise, the speculation is misguided.
Yeah, I think you mustn't underestimate that I really, really have gone a long way to get this regional decision-making, and I will have to accept there will be some programmes here which I might not personally approve of. But, I've been convinced, having talked to Scottish farmers, and I'll hear a lot about it probably at the show next week, and I tend to come back quite soon. I suspect if I go and see a recipient of the CAST scheme, they'll make a very good case that it has real value.
Okay, thank you. That's useful.
Claudia Beamish.
Secretary of State, you already touched on the capping for individual farmers, but could you just clarify for us what the UK government's position is on capping for payment, and what do you think the outcome will be in the eventual deal? And if it's voluntary, will the cap be introduced in England?
Well, I don't think we should have capping. I think you'll just lead to people going to unnecessary administrative measures to get round it. There's always a way round these things, no matter how cleverly the text is drafted. So, personally, I think if we want large, efficient units, I'm happy for them to receive funds as laid down across the board, regardless of the size of the unit. I think it's a big distraction. But for some member states, this is a really big deal. It's a big issue in the negotiations. But for me, I'd be against capping. I just want people to concentrate on the market and not to have to steer their business around various administrative obstacles.
But with respect, any regulation or cap or whatever, surely one can't justify not doing it simply because somebody might try and avoid it. I mean, that seems not to be a very strong argument to me, and there are a whole range. Although I appreciate the issue around the contribution that larger farmers across the UK and Europe make to the local economy, surely there should be a limit somewhere to what they're receiving.
Yeah, sure.
You're talking about the taxpayers' money, Secretary of State.
Yeah. And I want if people think that they can prosper and be efficient and compete in a worldwide market, how they organise the size of their units and their businesses should be entirely down to them based on the business requirement, not the administrative requirement. So if in order to get round the capping thing, they have to break their business up into different units and put under different names, that I'm sure will be terribly helpful to a few solicitors doing the title deeds, etc. But it's just a big distraction. I would like that farm to be concentrating on his stock and his genomics and technology he's using and training up his staff in the best way possible. That's a far better use of his time rather than messing around with the arrangements so he gets around some anomalous attempt to limit the payment. I would like people just to get on and be efficient.
Surely, Secretary of State, there'd be a way of looking at whether farms are being broken up because of this. And I'm just still making the point that you've stressed taxpayers' money and concerns about what that goes into. And a lot of people would argue, who are taxpayers across the UK, that there should be a limit to how much subsidy any individual business gets.
That's a point of view which I don't agree with. Absolutely. I just think we want to have a successful, efficient, prosperous, effective farming industry, and it should be driven by the requirements of the farming business And it's absolutely not for me as a politician to boss around and decide what that should be. But this is a classic case of my phrase, getting out of people's hair. Setting some totally arbitrary limit seems to be wholly unnecessary and probably regressive interference in the manner in which someone runs a business. But it gets right back to my first. You are touching on the live wire of how you justify this significant amount of taxpayers' money, and that's why I do think down the road it should be aimed progressively. It won't be in this round. We're going to have a very significant Pillar 1 in this round, which will go bluntly for paying people to carry on as they are. But we should be targeting the money more towards training, more towards technology, more towards development, and more towards the environment.
There's been quite a bit of discussion about a formula for the distribution of money in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. I wonder if you could write to us saying how this is going to be achieved and when it's going to be achieved.
Sure. I mean, as I said, talks are going on at official level on this. I mean, I think very happy to write to you on that, and there was the figure of 64 million touched on by Alex. I think, would it be sensible to wait until we've got through the June Council, when we really might have a better idea of exactly where we stand on the whole thing?
Yep, that would be fine.
It's a couple of weeks' time. I'm very happy to give you a resume. I'm very happy to come back if you want me to come and talk to the committee again.
I'm sure that's very likely indeed.
No, honestly, seriously, I think it's a very good idea that I keep in touch with you.
Indeed so. Right, move on to the subject of neonicotinoids. And Dick Lyle has the first question.
Yes, again, good morning, Secretary of State. I was very interested in the 2 points you made there. Move towards technology, move towards the environment. Your whole ethos this morning has to improve the environment, defend farmers, improve what we're doing. I have to compliment you by saying the UK government is doing good work on honeybees, but it's doing far less on wild bees. Don't we need a proper joined-up plan to deal with all the causes, the extreme causes, I would suggest, of bee decline and all the species of bee, not just the honeybee?
Absolutely, which is exactly what we're doing. We have made this, a matter of major priority in our discussions. I've talked to Ian Boyd, our Chief Scientific Advisor from St Andrews, who is absolutely clear with me that pollinators are absolutely fundamental to our whole farming industry and our whole plant environment. But he also has been very clear and very sensible on this, that we should look at the evidence. And his considered opinion was that the proposed ban of these particular 3 products, the 3 nicotinoids, were based on lab trials which, in his opinion, exaggerated the dose by between 2 and 10 times, and could have been further compounded by the fact that bees actually like a diluted sugar solution. So he was not at all convinced about the validity of these lab trials, and he wanted us to look at the results of an analysis of our field trials, which were conducted last summer, mainly on bumblebees. Now, when this came up in the Council, I raised it under any other business, and I asked that there should not be a precipitate action taken, but that the Commission should wait and see the analysis of our data, and there should be further field trials right across the European Union. And we had significant support for this. So, for instance, if you take Hungary, Hungary has 2 million hectares under sunflowers, rape and maize, all using neonicotinoids extensively. The Hungarians have a very strict regime. There are strict conditions that the ground's got to be damp, there mustn't be any wind to stop any dust, etc. And they also have a very significant honey industry. They have a massive vested interest in a large, thriving bee population. And I've talked to them at the Council, and we've had confirmation in writing. I think their honey production has been about 20,000 tonnes a year, and it stayed steady, and their considered opinion is that their bee populations have actually increased. So this was not a simplistic argument. There was a huge public campaign. I had 85,000 emails to my patterson@parliament.uk address, and I think we had 72,000 at DEFRA. But however intense the interest was in this, there wasn't a lot of evidence thrown in. And I was absolutely clear that we should not take a precipitate step against what is fairly recent technology without a clue as to what the replacement will be. So when the next council came along, we had our field data published, and it is, Ian's been absolutely clear on this. You know, our analysis was done quite speedily, and he felt we needed more field trials because these were only limited in one part of the UK, and it would have been very helpful if we'd had field trials in other countries. So, for instance, Austria had done quite a lot of work on this. As I already touched on Hungary. Italy was very concerned about this. And when the vote came, I think it was unfortunate. There was no qualifying majority for a ban. There was no qualifying majority for our position, which was to hold back and conduct more field trials. And the Commission has gone ahead with a ban. Now, we're in a mess because we need to conduct more field trials. And the options for our farmers are they either drop these crops completely or they use pretty unpleasant alternatives, which may well be licensed and legal, but are not environment-friendly products. Pyrethroids, carbamates, organophosphates. You know, these are old technologies going back to the 1950s and 60s. And I think it was a mistake to just do a snap ban on these products without considering what the alternatives are. And what will happen, of course, we're talking about making farming efficient, using technology, there will definitely be a significant reduction in production. I mean, I was in Warwick talking to the NFU on the day of the vote. I was in and out of a meeting with the Warwick NFU. I mean, there were guys there who are big users. They were looking at a reduction in production of about 30-40%. So I don't think this has been well handled. And what I would like to see, and I'm pushing for this, is that the Commission does allow continued field trials to get real data on real bees in real fields. So I think we can make a much more rational decision.
That actually explains, our next question, but I know you have to go shortly, Minister. That explains to me why we abstained and then we voted against the moratorium. Thank you very much for that information. Thank you.
Supplementary, because we know we are wrapping up very rapidly.
It will be brief, Secretary of State. I absolutely take your point about the alternatives, and there is a concern there about alternatives to neonicotinoids. However, when you talk about evidence, are you aware of the findings of a Dundee University study into this issue in relation to the decline in populations? And it was evidence that chimes with the experiences of the soft fruit farmers in the constituency that I represent.
Oh, yeah, there are all sorts of very important studies, and certainly we know things like the Dundee study we would take account of, but it goes back to Mr. Lyle's first question. What we're going to do very shortly is to launch a major strategy on bees. I mean, you cannot underestimate how important bees are to our whole agricultural industry and plant health. We've absolutely got to find out what's going on. Now, you talk to some beekeepers, they say this is all very much down to the weather. As I said, you talk to the Hungarians, they are emphatic that they were very happy with extensive use of neonicotinoids being compatible with a thriving bee population, an increasing bee population, and a substantial honey industry. So this was very much not a black and white case. I think, but what was screamingly obvious, we needed more evidence. So very much welcome stuff, like you mentioned from Dundee. What I'd like to see is far more studies. And that was the frustration I got from the Hungarian minister and certainly the Austrian minister, who had done quite a lot of work on this. That, you know, in fairness, they had been working through this. And, you know, there was Austrian Minister Niki Balakovic came out of a significant attack at home and in his parliament for, you know, opposing the ban because he wanted to carry on doing more field work. And I think that's really where we should go. So I am talking to the Commission still. We do need to carry on doing field trials because I think, however legal and licensed these alternatives may be, they are slipping back to older technologies which could be very damaging to the environment.
We have to finish up now, but since you mentioned at the beginning that you're a supporter of the extension of GM crop technology for human consumption, and we're reminded in the Daily Mail today that you're making a speech next year on GM crops being safe. I wonder if I could point out that we have a question under aquaculture about the physical dangers that there are of GM salmon from the USA breeding with trout which is an example that may well become more known about. But to keep it on agriculture, just as a parting thought, I wonder what your thoughts are about this. What do you think the worldwide perception of Scotch whisky would be if the malting barley that's being grown in a field is next to a field of GM oilseed rape?
That's a good question. I think the public mood is moving rapidly on this. There are 17 million farmers cultivating 170 million hectares. That's 12% of the world arable land. That's 7 times the geographical area of the whole of the UK. And I really don't know of a single case of a health problem in any single human being. So trillions of meals have been eaten from products directly which were GM. And in this country, we know perfectly well, it's getting increasingly hard to buy non-GM animal feed. 85% of the animal feed here is GM origin. So it's pretty well impossible, I would suggest, to go into the streets of Edinburgh after this and buy a meat product which probably has come from an animal which has not eaten GM at some stage in its career, and we're all completely healthy. 80% of the world's cotton crop is GM. Hands up, anyone around this table who is feeling uncomfortable.
I think
GM is now...
we're talking about food here. Let's stick
sure.
with the food.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about food. But
We're not talking about cotton. We're talking about...
No, you asked me directly about public perception. Mm-hmm. So not one of you has put your hand up saying you're uncomfortable wearing a GM cotton shirt. Right. So I think your question was about public perception. And I think the public mood has moved on because there is such a vast production of GM around the world. It is now being accepted in the public mind. And of course, there are some scientists which say it's safer. Now, you raised a very interesting question of the genetically modified salmon. That is why I've been emphatically clear all along that we will have to bring the public with us and we will have to respect all the careful controls that have been set up. At the moment, it is most unsatisfactory that we have a block. So last year in the wet weather, we had an appalling problem with potato blight. That is a very real cost to our farmers. It's a very real cost to our consumers. They have to pay higher costs because we lose so much potato because of blight. So I think cautiously and judiciously, I would like to begin to work with our European colleagues. We know in some countries, I talked to the German minister about this, there is huge opposition in somewhere like Germany. There are other European countries where the populace is much more relaxed about GM. So I'm not talking about any sudden great leap. But what I'm absolutely clear about, if we don't begin to make progress on this, Europe will slip further and further behind. And the danger of that is, and you've seen it with the issue of neonicotinoids, we fall back on older, outdated technologies, which are not necessarily environmentally friendly, are significantly less efficient, and the phrase is that Europe will become the museum of world farming, and I don't want to see that.
I mean, the point is you have a very short time, but there is no problem in other European countries getting non-GM soya. Only in this country is this cited as a problem. And we have this evidence on the aquaculture bill we've just dealt with, and I think it would be important for you to recognise that in Scotland here that the question of food labelling and authenticity of food is something which we take very strongly, because people do want to know that the product is absolutely uncontaminated by anything that smacks of an effect on the environment, like the glyphosate does and so on. So your proposals may mean that you think that GM food is safe, but it's certainly not through the byproducts of GM.
Well, I'm afraid so.
Cultivation.
I'm terribly sorry to end on a discordant note. I wholly disagree with you. I talked to a major farmer in Dorset recently who has significant farming interests in the USA, and he told me he'd got rid of all his spraying equipment because all his product there is GM, and he does not spray. There are very significant environmental advantages in GM technology. So we're worried about neonicotinoid sprays and these other materials. They've gone. You do not have to spray for some of these products. There is massive gain in diesel usage and compaction of soil. So it isn't black and white question on the environment. There are very significant gains of these technologies when they're used judiciously. And if we don't embrace technologies, we will not feed the 79 billion people we're going up to. And you look at what Norman Borlaug did, the stuff on the Green Revolution. I grew up, and I was at school in the 1960s, to give you an idea how old I am. There was very significant worries about famine in some Asian countries. Again, to China, just after the Gang of Four had fallen, they weren't able to feed themselves. The Green Revolution has been of a massive benefit to hundreds of millions of human beings. And that is because people in those days wisely embraced the new green technologies. And we cannot shut our eyes to the advantages of some of these technologies. We go into them carefully, judiciously, with properly controlled means of regulation. But just to turn our back on them, I think will be a very big mistake. It will be bad for the future of our own industry. It will be very bad for developing countries. And ultimately, the key thing, it will be very bad for the environment.
Thank you very much for that. We will have to agree to differ, and it might well be the subject of a future meeting between us, because we realise that you have to go to another meeting soon. We are happy to talk about this for a lot longer, and unfortunately some of our questions were truncated as it was. But as a first visit to here, I'd like to thank Owen Patterson for coming with his team, and indeed that we look forward to seeing you again. So thank you, Secretary of State. We will have a break of 5 minutes at the moment so that we can clear the room for the next item. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I very much look forward to coming back.
get started with the item on subordinate legislation. We hopefully should get the Minister in as we're doing this, but the second item today is for the committee to consider a negative instrument in relation to animal health as listed on the agenda. A member should note that no motion to annul has been received in relation to the instrument. I refer members to the paper, and you'll note that there's a minor question of the use of EU when it should be EC in the recommendation of what's the sub-ledge committee called now?
It came from the Subordinate Legislation Committee when it was considered, but it would now be the Delegate Powers and Law Reform Committee. However, it wasn't when this was considered.
Well, we're glad to hear about this new name. And, so therefore I ask the committee to, if you're agreed, that we do not wish to make any recommendation in relation to this instrument. We're agreed. Thank you very much. The committee is agreed. We're moving on to agenda item 3, Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill. And I welcome Paul Wheelhouse, the Minister for Environment and Climate Change, who is the member in charge of the bill. I also welcome the officials who are accompanying the Minister. We have no amendments to deal with, but in terms of the standing orders, we're obliged to consider each section and schedule of the bill and the long title and agree to each formally. We will take the sections in order, with the schedule being taken immediately after the section that introduces it and the long title last. Fortunately, standing orders allow us to put a single question where groups of sections or schedules are to be considered consecutively. And unless members disagree, that is what I propose to do.
Is it possible to just ask a general question before we move on to the formal process?
A general question on this?
Of the Minister. Or will that come up in the process?
It won't come up in the process. If it's a short question and the Minister is prepared to take that, I'd be happy to ask for Alec Ferguson to ask the question.
I can assure you of a short question, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Sorry to overcomplicate the process. No, I just wonder whether you could say a few words about why, given the issues raised, particularly by Sir Crispin Agnew, and the concerns he raised about some parts of the bill not really matching up with others, if I can use that loose terminology, if you could just briefly explain why you've seen fit not to bring forward some amendments to address the concerns he raised.
Clearly, Convener, we are aware there are a number of alternative views about the particular form of the bill, the content of the bill, obviously, as we discussed at stage 1 debate. We are aware of those views and respect very much the opinions of Sir Crispin Agnew and Derek Flynn and others, including Brian Inkster. But we believe the bill provides the necessary clarity and legal certainty that the owner-occupier crofters are looking for, and indeed many stakeholders are looking for, in order to allow owner-occupier crofters to be able to decroft their land, and that the Commission has obviously will have the power to consider such applications after the bill hopefully is enacted. The Scottish Government consider the detailed drafting issues raised, and I can promise you that we have gone over them in some detail. However, we do consider the bill as drafted achieves its purpose, which I think a number of the key witnesses to the committee agreed with, Sir Crispin Agnew himself, the Commission through the former David Balhary and Derek Flynn all agreed that the bill delivered on the purpose of as set out by government. And that is obviously to allow owner-occupier crofters the ability to decroft. The Scottish Government is committed to drafting in as plain and accessible manner as consistent with achieving the necessary outcome. And we all know crofting law is horrendously complicated. I think that was a message that came across loud and clear at the debate last week. I certainly don't disagree with that conclusion that many members reached. But the key thing for me, as I said in the stage 1 debate, was that this bill, in the current form it has, is we've kept it as closely as we possibly could to provisions for tenant crofters. And that will enable us to deliver, as I think we all want, similar treatment. I can't prejudge that, obviously, the committee, but I think in terms of the nature of the debate that's been held so far, that we want to be able to give owner-occupier crofters the similar provisions to those for tenant crofters were were appropriate. Obviously, there's some aspects that had to be modified to do with the land tenure and right to buy, but in respect of the general provisions. And in order to do that, we've kept as close as possible to the original wording for the provisions for the tenant crofters. So it has taken a particular form. I appreciate some people have some concerns that maybe it could have been simpler, but then there would have been more room for perhaps doubt that the provisions were meant to be the same as those for tenant crofters. So by taking this view, we've managed to minimise that, I think, and hopefully that answers your question.
It certainly does in much more detail than I was expecting. So thank you for that. But could I just clarify that my reason for raising that was not to question the purpose of the bill or indeed its likely outcome. It was I'm simply looking for confirmation, which I think you've now given me, that you looked at the very technical drafting points raised by Sir Crispin Agnew, which weren't really questioning the outcome of the bill. They were questioning whether the bill actually worked, or separate parts of the bill worked together in a way that's way beyond my ken. Now, the fact is you've told me, I think, quite clearly that you have looked at all that. You're satisfied with the way the bill is drafted, and I'm quite happy to accept that. But it's good to have it on the record, Minister. Thank you.
Okay. No further questions at the moment. Right, we'll go into the process of stage 2. Firstly, the question is that sections 1 and 2, the schedule, and sections 3 to 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are all agreed, so they are agreed. Secondly, the question is that the long title be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are all agreed. That ends stage 2 consideration of the bill. I thank the Minister and his team for their brief visit. I'm sorry you were kept waiting, but we consider it's important, and if we have any arguments with the business managers, I hope that we're not going to have a 2.5-hour debate about this bill at stage 3, as members might even be stretched in their knowledge of crofting in order to fill that time.
I concur with your
thank
view.
You. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
We move on to agenda item 4, which is about petitions, and I would urge you to have the paper on this in front of you just now, as there are 4 to be considered. Sorry, 3 to be considered. Wait a minute, 3 to be considered. Let's get into that stage in the day. So, we have as a final item the petition PE 1336, PE 1450 and PE 1386, and we agreed in our work programme to have a look at some of these and see whether we can actually decide that we've dealt with them or not. And I'm open to suggestions from members about what they think the outcome should be, as there are options in the paper. So dealing with PE 1336, which is about farm salmon and sea lice, and looking at the options there, what are members prepared to suggest we should do? Over to you, Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. I'm not quite sure it's declaring interest, but I am a sea trout champion, so I felt I should just highlight that point. We have had a lot of evidence, as is highlighted, from a range of groups and indeed individuals about the sea lice issue. And it's my view that because of the point that I would like to see us continuing to monitor the situation and request further updates on this. And there are a range of groups from Scottish Government that are going to be looking at the issue, and the Minister's given a commitment to this, that I would see that it might be appropriate to close the petition at this stage.
Yes, Alec Ferguson.
No, I won't be long. I also concur with that, but I'm afraid I don't think this is a subject that's going to go away. I noted with interest that Marine Harvest have announced that they are going to seek certification. Part of the certification process eventually will involve publication of farm-by-farm weekly sea lice data. Now, that frankly raises the question even more than it was raised as an evidence. Why isn't the rest of the industry prepared to go along with it? So I'm perfectly happy to close the petition. We've had huge debate on it, I accept that, but this ain't going away. This is coming back.
Yes, I'm concurring with my fellow colleagues here. As it notes in the paper on page 2, the Minister has given a commitment to keep the issue of sea lice reporting under review. Us, of course, as the scrutinising committee, should ensure that the Minister does that. So it would be us as an action point to keep in the backs of our minds to ensure that the Minister does keep sea lice under review. And if he didn't, then I'm sure some of us here will raise that at committee in the future, but I'm sure he shall.
Well, I think I get the sense that we want to close the petition, that we want to keep a monitor on the sea lice issue, and that indeed probably we should put it in our work programme to be able to do so in a regular fashion. We're agreed about that. Thank you. PE 1450 from Mr James Mackey, looking at scientific studies. He, on the behaviour density, longevity, survival rate and the genetic and DNA markers in wild sea trout and brown trout in rivers that are stocked with farmed brown trout and hatchery reared Atlantic salmon. Members have a view on that? Yes?
Now that the Aquaculture and Fisheries Scotland Bill has been passed by the Scottish Parliament, but it didn't include the specific data sought by the petition, I would ask that we write to the Scottish Government, ask them for an update, any other views on this petition, and reconsider the petition when the information has been received.
Well, very good. We've managed to sort of take that point. Do we therefore think that we should keep it open at the moment, or can we close it, given the Aquaculture Bill's activities, or do you think we should keep the petition open while we're doing as was suggested in the paper?
I would suggest that we keep it open until we receive the information back from the Scottish Government.
Do members concur? Yes. We do. Okay. We move on to petition PE 1386 by Richard Munday. This, as you'll recall, which we took evidence on, is about static gear only inshore fisheries, particularly in Loch Torridon. And you can see that we have a number of opportunities here to decide what to do. Do members have a view? Nigel?
Thank you, Convener. My instinct on this is that we have a government response, unlike the previous petition where we want a government response. It seems to me that the right thing to do when you have a government response is to send it back to the petitioner. That really is the right part of the process, I think, and to see what the petitioner has to say to the government's response. We don't necessarily want a very long game of ping-pong, but I suggest it would be appropriate to let the petitioner have his say at this point.
And that major document which we have of 2.5 pages is something that they should comment on, and then whatever. So we would keep the petition open and write to the petitioner to seek the views on the information provided by the Scottish Government. I wonder if I might add that this is the kind of thing that might make a useful part of our away day activities, in part. It may be, I don't know whether it's possible, but it is precisely the kind of thing to see on the ground how MPAs and inshore fishery groups and so on are likely to work. But I leave that with the potential when we're talking about that work planning day for the moment, because I'm sure the clerks will come back with their own ideas about what we should be doing. But we can decide in the end. Thank you. So thank you very much for the consideration of the petitions and your comments upon them. I now close the meeting. Our next meeting on the 19th June, the committee will take evidence from the chair of the TFF on rent reviews, hear a report from Jane Baxter on ICI's community transport, ICI's community transport inquiry, consider a draft stage 1 report on the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. And please note that the committee is also meeting on the following day, Thursday the 20th of June at 9 a.m. for a session with the European Environment Commissioner, Janez Potočnik. Thank you. Yes, I'm making arrangements to be here.